the frozen heart of 1887, Colorado, a pregnant woman stands on an auction block like cattle while her own father counts the coins that will seal her fate. But when a mysterious mountain man steps forward with $5 gold, he's not just buying a bride, he's challenging a corrupt system that treats human souls as property. Will love bloom in the wilderness, or will the railroad's greed destroy everything they're fighting to build? If you want to discover how this incredible tale of survival, love, and redemption unfolds in the unforgiving Colorado mountains, stay with me until the very end. And please comment below with your city or country so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Your engagement means everything to me as a storyteller. Now let me take you back to that bitter winter day when everything changed. The wind howled down from the Rockies like the breath of some ancient, vengeful god, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would bury the small mining town of Cedar Ridge beneath 3 feet of snow before morning. It was the kind of cold that made men's bones ache and their hearts grow harder, the kind of day when decent folk stayed indoors and left the streets to those with nowhere else to go. Mary Beth Briggs pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her swollen belly as her father dragged her through the muddy main street, his calloused fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave bruises. At 7 months pregnant, every step was a struggle, but Harlan Briggs showed no mercy for his daughter's condition. If anything, her pregnancy only seemed to fuel his anger. "Move faster, girl," he growled, spitting tobacco juice into the slush. "We're already late, and I ain't about to lose money because you can't keep up." Mary Beth bit back the words that burned in her throat. She'd learned long ago that talking back to her father only made things worse. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the curious stares and whispered comments from the townspeople they passed. "Is that Harlan Briggs's girl?" she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her companion. "The one who got herself in trouble with that traveling preacher." "Shame on her family," came the reply. "No decent woman would find herself in such a state." The words cut deeper than the wind, but Mary Beth kept her eyes fixed on the wooden sidewalk ahead. She knew what they thought of her, a fallen woman, damaged goods, a stain on her family's already tarnished reputation. The truth was more complicated, but truth had little value in a town like Cedar Ridge. The traveling preacher they spoke of had been a smooth-talking con man named Ezekiel Hawthorne, who'd swept into town the previous spring with a silver tongue and promises of salvation. He'd singled out Mary Beth at a church social, whispering sweet words about God's plan for their lives together, about the missionary work they'd do, spreading the gospel across the frontier. She'd been 18 and naive, desperate to escape her father's house and the endless cycle of his drinking and rage. When Ezekiel had asked her to meet him privately to discuss their calling, she'd gone willingly, believing his talk of marriage and a better life. The memory of that night still made her stomach turn. There had been no gentle courtship, no tender words of love. Ezekiel had taken what he wanted with rough hands and cruel laughter, holding her down when she tried to resist, telling her that this was God's will, that she should be grateful for his attention. When she'd missed her monthly flow and realized she was with child, she'd gone to him in desperate hope, only to find his camp abandoned and the man himself long gone. The townspeople had put the pieces together quickly enough, and the whispers had started immediately. Her father had been furious, not out of any protective instinct for his daughter, but because her shame reflected poorly on him. Harlan Briggs was a man who cared more about appearances than truth, more about his reputation in the saloons than his daughter's well-being. "Here we are," Harlan announced, stopping in front of Murphy's General Store. A small crowd had already gathered, despite the weather, drawn by curiosity and the promise of entertainment. "Remember what I told you, girl. Keep your mouth shut and do what you're told. Maybe we can salvage something from this mess you've made." Mary Beth's heart sank as she saw the makeshift platform that had been erected in front of the store. She'd heard rumors about such things happening in other towns. Desperate families selling off unwanted daughters, usually to men heading west, who needed wives but couldn't afford the time or effort to court them properly. She'd never imagined she'd find herself in such a position. Sheriff Tom Brennan stood near the platform, his badge glinting dully in the gray afternoon light. He was supposed to oversee the proceedings to make sure everything was legal and above board, but Mary Beth could see the discomfort in his weathered face. Tom had known her since she was a little girl, had even courted her mother before Harlan swept her off her feet with promises he'd never kept. "Now, folks," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "we're here today to conduct a legal proceeding. Miss Mary Elizabeth Briggs is seeking a husband, and any interested parties may make their intentions known." The euphemisms made Mary Beth want to laugh if she hadn't felt so much like crying. This wasn't a courtship or a proper engagement. It was an auction, plain and simple. She was being sold to the highest bidder, and everyone present knew it. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" called out Jake Murphy, the store owner, stepping forward with the enthusiasm of a practiced auctioneer. "She's healthy, can cook and clean, and, as you can see, she's already proven her fertility." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd at that comment, and Mary Beth felt her cheeks burn with shame. She kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the gathering, trying to pretend she was somewhere else, anywhere else. "I'll start the bidding at $1, a voice called out from the back. Mary Beth recognized him as Pete Kowalski, a farmer with a reputation for working his horses to death. The thought of being trapped on his isolated homestead made her skin crawl. $2, countered another voice. This one belonged to Samuel Curtis, a widower with 3 young children and wandering hands. Mary Beth had heard stories about what had happened to his first wife, whispered tales of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. The bidding continued, creeping upward in small increments. $3 from old Henrik Larson, whose previous 2 wives had both died under mysterious circumstances. $4 from Red Jack McGillicuddy, a saloon owner with connections to some of the territory's more unsavory elements. With each bid, Mary Beth felt another piece of her soul being bartered away. These men weren't interested in her as a person. They saw her as property, a possession to be acquired and used as they saw fit. The child growing within her would be raised by whichever man could scrape together the most coins, and she would have no say in the matter. $4.50, came a new voice, and Mary Beth looked up to see Dr. Jonathan Whitmore step forward. She felt a flicker of hope. The doctor was at least a decent man, known for his kindness to his patients and his charitable work among the town's poor. But that hope was quickly dashed when she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't compassion or even genuine affection. It was the calculating gaze of a man who saw an opportunity. Dr. Whitmore was getting on in years, and his practice had been struggling since the younger Dr. Matthews had arrived in town. A pregnant wife might provide him with a steady supply of patients, especially if she proved capable of bearing more children. $5, called out Red Jack, clearly determined not to be outbid. Mary Beth closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of men haggling over her future like they were discussing the price of livestock. In her mind, she said a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening, begging for deliverance from this nightmare. That's when she heard it, the sound of heavy boots, moving through the crowd, accompanied by murmurs of surprise and not a little fear. $5 gold. The voice was deep and rough, like gravel sliding down a mountainside. It carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and it cut through the other conversations like a knife through silk. Mary Beth opened her eyes and saw the crowd parting to make way for a figure that seemed to have stepped out of legend itself. He was tall, taller than any man she'd ever seen, easily standing head and shoulders above the tallest person in the gathering. His hair was dark as midnight and hung loose to his shoulders, framing a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore buckskins that had seen hard use, a heavy coat made from what looked like wolf fur, and boots that had clearly traveled many miles through rough country. A rifle was slung across his back, and a knife the size of a small sword hung at his hip. Everything about him spoke of the wild places beyond civilization, of a life lived by different rules than those that governed the small town of Cedar Ridge. But it was his eyes that captured Mary Beth's attention, pale blue like winter ice, yet somehow burning with an inner fire that made her breath catch in her throat. When his gaze met hers across the crowd, she felt something shift inside her chest, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. $5 gold, he repeated, his voice carrying easily across the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathering. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and produced 5 gleaming coins, holding them up so everyone could see. American gold, not script or promises. The crowd erupted in excited whispers. Gold was rarely seen in Cedar Ridge, where most transactions were conducted in silver coins or trade goods. $5 gold was more money than most of the men present had seen in months. "Now hold on there, stranger," Red Jack protested, his face flushing red with anger. "This here's a civilized proceeding. We can't just—" "The law says any man can bid," Sheriff Brennan interrupted, though his hand rested nervously on his gun butt. He clearly recognized the danger radiating from the newcomer and had no desire to provoke a confrontation. "And $5 gold is the highest bid we've heard." Harlan Briggs stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with greed as he stared at the coins in the stranger's hand. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when he was trying to squeeze more money out of a deal. "How do we know you're good for it? How do we know you'll treat the girl proper?" The stranger's pale eyes fixed on Harlan with such intensity that the older man actually took a step backward. "You're selling your daughter like a piece of cattle," the mountain man said, his voice deadly quiet. "Don't talk to me about treating her proper." The words hit like a physical blow, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the truth of the situation, but nobody had been willing to speak it aloud. This stranger had no such reservations. "Now see here," Harlan began, but the mountain man cut him off with a gesture. "The bidding's closed," he announced, tossing the 5 gold coins to Murphy, who caught them with shaking hands. "The woman comes with me." "Hold on just a minute," Dr. Whitmore protested. "This isn't how these things are done. There are procedures, papers to be signed, arrangements to be made. We don't even know your name, sir." The stranger turned his attention to the doctor, and Whitmore visibly wilted under that icy stare. "Name's Jonas Rohr," he said simply, "and the only paper I need is whatever makes this legal and binding. After that, the woman comes with me." Mary Beth found her voice for the first time since the proceedings had begun. "Don't I get a say in this?" she asked, her words carrying clearly across the silent crowd. Jonas Rohr turned those winter blue eyes on her, and she felt that strange shifting sensation in her chest again. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, and Mary Beth had the oddest feeling that he was seeing her, really seeing her in a way that no one else ever had. "You can say no," he told her, his voice gentler now, but still carrying that underlying note of absolute certainty. "You can stay here and take your chances with the next highest bidder, or whatever your father has planned for you next. But if you come with me, you'll be safe. I give you my word on that." Safe. The word echoed in Mary Beth's mind, like a prayer finally answered. When was the last time she'd felt truly safe? Not since her mother had died 5 years ago, certainly. Not in her father's house, where the sound of his footsteps on the stairs at night filled her with dread. Not in this town, where she was already marked as a fallen woman and would spend the rest of her life paying for one moment of naive trust. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some curious, some disapproving, some openly hostile. These people had known her all her life, but none of them had stepped forward to help when she'd needed it most. They'd been content to let her father sell her off like livestock, to let her become someone else's problem. "What guarantee do we have that you won't just abandon her somewhere?" Sheriff Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he was going through the motions rather than expressing genuine concern. Jonas reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper, handing it to the sheriff. "Deed to my property up in the high country," he said. "Section 12, Range 4 West. It's worth more than 5 times what I'm paying here. If I don't treat the woman right, you know where to find me." Brennan examined the document, his eyebrows rising as he read. "This is a lot of land," he said, clearly impressed, despite himself. "Good timber, probably mineral rights too. Why would you risk it for a woman you've never met?" "That's my business," Jonas replied. Mary Beth realized that everyone was looking at her, waiting for her decision. Her father stood nearby, practically drooling over the gold coins that would soon be his. The other bidders glared at her with various degrees of resentment and frustrated desire. The townspeople watched with the avid interest of spectators at a horse race. Only Jonas Rohr seemed unconcerned with her choice, as if he'd made his offer and was content to let her decide without pressure or manipulation. There was something in his stance, patient but not passive, strong but not threatening, that reminded her of the mountains themselves, eternal and unshakable. "If I come with you," she said carefully, "what would you expect of me? Honest work for honest treatment," he replied without hesitation. "You cook, clean, mend what needs mending. I provide food, shelter, and protection, nothing more unless you choose it." The way he said those last words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold wind. There was a promise buried in them, or perhaps just a possibility, but either way, it was more respect than anyone else had shown her in months. "And the baby?" she asked, her hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. "Will be raised as mine," Jonas said simply. No questions asked, no shame attached. "A child is a blessing, not a burden." Mary Beth felt tears pricking at her eyes. When was the last time anyone had spoken of her unborn child as anything other than evidence of her sin and shame? This stranger, this mountain man who'd appeared out of nowhere, was offering her something she'd thought was lost forever, a chance at a new beginning. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision she was making. A collective sigh went up from the crowd, whether of relief or disappointment, she couldn't tell. Her father stepped forward, extending his hand toward the gold coins Murphy still held. "Now hold on there, Harlan," Sheriff Brennan said. "There's still paperwork to be done. This needs to be recorded proper, especially if there's property involved." "The courthouse is closed," Harlan protested, his eyes never leaving the gold. "Can't we handle the papers tomorrow?" "The lady comes with me now," Jonas said, his tone brooking no argument. "Papers can be filed later." "But that's not," Dr. Whitmore began. He was cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, the long, mournful howl of a wolf, echoing down from the mountains that surrounded the town. It was answered by another howl, then another, until the air was filled with their wild music. Jonas tilted his head, listening to something the others couldn't hear. "Storm's coming," he said matter-of-factly. "Big one. We need to leave now if we're going to make it to shelter before it hits." As if summoned by his words, the wind suddenly picked up, sending a whirlwind of snow and ice crystals swirling through the crowd. People began pulling their coats tighter and looking nervously at the darkening sky. "Where exactly are you taking her?" Sheriff Brennan asked, having to raise his voice over the growing wind. "Home," Jonas replied simply. He turned to Mary Beth and extended his hand. "Time to go." Mary Beth hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the town where she'd lived her entire life. It wasn't much a collection of wood-frame buildings huddled together against the wilderness, populated by people who were quick to judge and slow to forgive. But it was all she'd ever known. Then she thought about the alternative. Red Jack McGillicuddy's meaty hands and the smell of stale whiskey that followed him everywhere. Dr. Whitmore's clinical examination of her body and his plans to use her as breeding stock for future patients. Her father's house where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden and a constant reminder of shame. She placed her hand in Jonas's and felt his fingers close around hers with surprising gentleness. His skin was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold, and completely steady. For the first time in months, she felt anchored to something solid. Wait, Harlan called out as Jonas began leading her away from the platform. What about my money? Jonas paused, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. You'll get your 30 pieces of silver, he said, his voice dripping with disgust. But don't expect to see your daughter again. Now see here, Harlan spluttered. Wow, she's my blood, my responsibility. I have rights. You gave up your rights the moment you put her on that platform. Jonas cut him off. From now on, she's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. There was something in the way he said those words that made even the boldest men in the crowd take a step back. This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never made a promise he couldn't keep. Come on, Jonas said to Mary Beth, his voice gentling again. My horse is just down the street. As they walked away from the crowd, Mary Beth heard the whispers starting up again behind them. Did you see the size of him? Must be 7 feet tall at least. Those were wolf skins he was wearing, real wolves. I heard tell of a mountain man up in the high country. Folks say he can talk to the animals, make them do his bidding. Probably just stories. Maybe, but I wouldn't want to cross him either way. Jonas seemed oblivious to the speculation swirling around him, focused entirely on getting Mary Beth to his horse. The animal was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a massive black stallion with intelligent eyes and a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian. It stood nearly 18 hands high with the muscled build of a horse bred for mountain work. Easy Thunder, Jonas murmured, running his hand along the animal's neck. The horse whickered softly in response, pressing its nose against his shoulder in a display of obvious affection. He's beautiful, Mary Beth breathed, reaching out tentatively to touch the stallion's muzzle. Thunder regarded her with curious dark eyes before gently nuzzling her palm. He likes you, Jonas observed with what might have been surprise. Thunder's not usually friendly with strangers. Mary Beth felt a flutter of pleasure at the observation. If this magnificent creature could accept her, maybe there was hope for her new life after all. Jonas helped her up onto the horse's back, his hands strong and careful as he lifted her. Despite her pregnant condition, she felt secure in the saddle, especially when Jonas swung up behind her. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she was surrounded by the comforting warmth of his body and the masculine scents of leather pine and something wild and clean that she couldn't quite identify. Hold on, he murmured in her ear, and she felt his breath warm against her skin. Thunder moved forward with a smooth, ground-eating stride that carried them quickly away from the town center and toward the trail that led up into the mountains. Mary Beth looked back once to see the crowd still gathered around the platform, her father clutching his gold coins, while Sheriff Brennan tried to restore some semblance of order. Then they rounded a bend in the trail, and Cedar Ridge disappeared behind them, as if it had never existed at all. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves on the snow-packed trail and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Mary Beth had expected to feel afraid riding off into the wilderness with a complete stranger, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Are you warm enough? Jonas asked after they'd been riding for several minutes. Yes, she replied, and realized it was true. Despite the bitter cold, she felt warmer than she had all day, wrapped in Jonas's coat and sheltered by his bulk from the worst of the wind. Good. We've got about 2 hours of riding ahead of us, maybe more if the snow gets heavier. My cabin's up past the timberline in a valley most folks don't even know exists. Mary Beth absorbed this information, trying to imagine what kind of life awaited her in such an isolated place. Do you live alone up there? She asked. Usually. Sometimes I get visitors, trappers passing through, Indians trading for supplies, but mostly it's just me and whatever animals happen by. Doesn't it get lonely? Jonas was quiet for so long that Mary Beth began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he was considering the question for the first time. Lonely's different from alone, he said slowly. I've been alone by choice for a long time, but lonely, That's when you're surrounded by people who don't see you, don't understand. You don't want to know the real you. I'd rather be alone in the mountains than lonely in a crowd. His words resonated with something deep inside her chest. She'd been lonely for so long, even before the incident with Ezekiel, even before her pregnancy made her an outcast. She'd been lonely in her father's house, lonely in church, lonely at social gatherings where she smiled and made small talk while feeling completely disconnected from everyone around her. "I understand," she said quietly. "I figured you might," Jonas replied, and she could hear the slight smile in his voice. They rode on in comfortable silence as the trail wound higher into the mountains. The trees grew thicker and taller, their snow-laden branches creating a natural cathedral around them. Mary Beth had never been this far from town before, and she found herself amazed by the raw beauty of the wilderness. Everything seemed bigger here, more dramatic. The mountains loomed above them like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in clouds. The silence was absolute except for the sounds they made themselves. Thunder's breathing, the creak of leather, the soft whisper of snow falling on pine needles. "Jonas," she said, after they'd been climbing for over an hour. "Yeah, thank you." He shifted slightly behind her, and she felt rather than saw him turn to look at her. "For what? For getting me out of there, for treating me like a person instead of property." "You are a person," he said simply. "Anyone who treats you otherwise is a fool." The matter-of-fact way he said it, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, made her throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such basic respect? "The people in town," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Don't much care what people in town think," Jonas said. "Most of them wouldn't last a week up here in the real world. They're soft, scared of anything they can't control or understand. Makes them mean sometimes, looking for someone to look down on to make themselves feel better." His assessment was harsh, but not inaccurate. Mary Beth had seen how quickly the townspeople turned on anyone who stepped outside their narrow definition of acceptable behavior. She'd been on the receiving end of their judgment, and it had been devastating. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you to the mountains?" Again that long pause before he answered. "War," he said finally. "Some things change. A man make it hard for him to fit into civilized society. Mountains don't judge, they just are." Mary Beth sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't push. Everyone had secrets, pain they carried from their past. If Jonas wanted to share more, he would do it in his own time. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that clung to their clothes and Thunder's mane. The wind had picked up as well, howling through the trees with increasing intensity. Mary Beth could feel the temperature dropping with each passing minute. "How much further?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Not far now. See that ridge up ahead? My valley's just on the other side." Mary Beth squinted through the swirling snow and could just make out a dark line of rock cutting across their path. The trail seemed to disappear into a narrow gap between two towering cliffs, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. "Looks dangerous," she observed. "It can be if you don't know what you're doing, but it's also what keeps unwanted visitors away. Not many people are willing to risk that passage, especially in weather like this." As they approached the gap, Mary Beth could see why. The walls rose up on either side like the gates of some ancient fortress, blocking out most of the remaining daylight. The trail was barely a ledge, carved into the rock face with a steep drop-off that disappeared into darkness below. Thunder picked his way carefully along the narrow path, his hooves finding secure footing on surfaces that looked treacherous to Mary Beth's untrained eye. Jonas guided the horse with subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure on the reins, clearly familiar with every inch of the route. "Easy does it, boy," he murmured to the stallion. "Almost through." The passage seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few minutes before they emerged into open space again. Mary Beth gasped at the sight that greeted them, a hidden valley nestled between towering peaks, protected on all sides by walls of stone and ice. Even in the gathering darkness and swirling snow, she could see that it was beautiful beyond description. Pine trees covered the valley floor like a green carpet, and a stream wound through the center, its waters dark and swift. At the far end, barely visible through the storm, she could make out the warm glow of windows in what must be Jonas's cabin. "Welcome home," Jonas said quietly. Home. The word echoed in Mary Beth's mind as thunder carried them down into the valley. She'd never had a real home. Her father's house had been a place of tension and fear, and the town had never truly accepted her. But this place, this hidden sanctuary in the mountains, felt different. It felt like possibility. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built from huge logs that had been fitted together with obvious skill and care. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and warm light spilled from windows that had been covered with what looked like oiled paper to keep out the wind. A small barn stood nearby, along with various outbuildings that suggested this was a working homestead rather than just a temporary shelter. Jonas helped her down from Thunder's back, his hands steady and sure as he lifted her, despite her pregnancy. "Get inside and warm up," he told her. "I'll take care of the horse and be right in." Mary Beth made her way to the cabin door, which opened at her touch, to reveal a single large room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The interior was spartanly furnished but clean and comfortable, with handmade furniture that showed the same attention to craftsmanship as the cabin itself. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, filling the space with warmth and dancing shadows. The walls were hung with various tools and weapons, and shelves held books, supplies, and what looked like Native American artifacts. Everything spoke of a man who was self-sufficient, but not uncivilized. Someone who had chosen solitude but hadn't abandoned all the comforts of home. Mary Beth moved closer to the fire, grateful for its warmth after the long, cold ride. She was still standing there, trying to absorb the reality of her new situation, when Jonas entered the cabin. He seemed even larger in the confined space, his head nearly brushing the ceiling beams. But his movements were careful and controlled, and he closed the door gently behind him before turning to study her face. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so," she replied honestly. "It's just a lot to take in." Jonas nodded as if he understood completely. "You must be tired and hungry. When's the last time you ate?" Mary Beth tried to remember. Her father had been too eager to get to town to bother with breakfast, and she'd been too nervous to eat much the day before. "Yesterday, I think." Jonas's expression darkened. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "I'll get you some food." As he moved around the kitchen area, preparing what looked like a simple but hearty meal, Mary Beth found herself studying him more closely. In the firelight, she could see details that had been hidden during their ride. His face was weathered but not old. She guessed he was probably in his early 30s. There were scars on his hands and forearms, the kind that came from hard work and dangerous living, but his movements were graceful, almost gentle, as he prepared her meal. "Here," he said, setting a bowl of stew and a piece of fresh bread in front of her. "It's not fancy, but it's hot and filling." The food was delicious, better than anything she'd eaten in months. As she ate, Jonas busied himself with various tasks around the cabin, giving her space to think and adjust to her new surroundings. "Jonas," she said when she'd finished eating. "Yeah? What happens now?" He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, his pale eyes serious. "Now you rest and get your strength back. Tomorrow we'll talk about arrangements, figure out how to make this work for both of us. But tonight you're safe and warm and fed. That's enough for now." Mary Beth felt tears pricking at her eyes again. It was such a simple thing, basic human kindness, but it was more than she'd received from anyone in months. "The sleeping area's up in the loft." Jonas continued, pointing toward a ladder that led to what looked like a small second floor. "There's blankets and a good mattress. I'll sleep down here by the fire." "You don't have to," she began. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "You're carrying a child, and you've had a hard day. You need proper rest." As Mary Beth climbed the ladder to the loft, she marveled at the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she'd been a disgraced woman facing an uncertain future. Now she was in a hidden valley in the mountains under the protection of a man who seemed to have stepped out of legend itself. The loft was small but comfortable, with a bed covered in what looked like hand-sewn quilts and furs. A small window looked out over the valley, though all she could see now was swirling snow and darkness. She settled onto the bed with a sigh of relief, her hand moving to rest on her swollen belly. "Well, little one," she whispered to her unborn child, "looks like we're starting a new life. I hope I'm making the right choice." From below, she could hear Jonas moving around the cabin, banking the fire and securing the cabin for the night. The sounds were comforting, domestic in a way that her father's house had never been. As sleep began to claim her, Mary Beth found herself thinking about the moment when Jonas had stepped forward at the auction. There had been something in his eyes, some recognition or understanding that had passed between them. She didn't know what it meant, but she had the feeling that this strange mountain man might be exactly what she and her baby needed. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside the cabin all was warm and safe and peaceful. For the first time in months, Mary Beth fell asleep without fear, protected by walls of stone and timber and the quiet presence of a man who had shown her more kindness in one day than she'd received from anyone in the town she'd left behind. The first chapter of her new life was just beginning. Mary Beth woke to the smell of coffee and bacon sunlight streaming through the small loft window in golden shafts that danced with dust motes. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, the familiar weight of dread that usually settled in her chest, upon waking, was absent, replaced by something she barely recognized as peace. Then memory flooded back. The auction, the mountain man named Jonas Rohr, the terrifying ride through the storm to this hidden valley. She sat up carefully, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, and peered down into the main room of the cabin. Jonas stood at the stove with his back to her, his massive frame somehow managing to look graceful as he tended to breakfast. He'd changed out of his travel clothes into clean buckskins, and his dark hair was tied back with a leather cord. Even from behind, he radiated a calm competence that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Morning," he called without turning around, apparently having heard her stirring. "Coffee's ready when you are." Mary Beth climbed down the ladder, acutely aware of how she must look after sleeping in her clothes. Her dress was wrinkled and travel-stained, her hair escaping from its pins in unruly tendrils. She felt self-conscious and uncertain, like a guest who wasn't sure of her welcome. "Did you sleep well?" Jonas asked, finally turning to face her. His pale blue eyes were kind but carefully neutral, giving her space to find her footing in this new reality. "Better than I have in months," she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. The ceramic mug was warm against her palms, and the coffee was strong and black, exactly what she needed to clear the fog from her mind. "Good. You needed the rest." Jonas returned to the stove where bacon sizzled in a cast-iron pan. "Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes." The domestic normalcy of the scene struck Mary Beth as almost surreal. Yesterday she'd been auctioned off like livestock, and now she was standing in a mountain cabin making small talk about breakfast with a man who was still essentially a stranger. Yet somehow it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for a very long time. "Can I help?" she asked, needing something to do with her hands. "If you want. There's bread in that cupboard there and plates on the shelf." They worked together in comfortable silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen area with an ease that surprised them both. When they sat down to eat, Mary Beth found herself studying Jonas's face in the morning light. The harsh angles she'd noticed yesterday had softened somewhat, revealing a man who was younger than she'd first thought, probably not much older than 30. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into mountain sun and wind, and a scar along his left jaw that looked like it had come from something with claws rather than a blade. But his hands were gentle as he buttered a piece of bread, and his voice was soft when he spoke. "We should talk about how this is going to work." he said, his tone matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "I don't want you feeling like you're trapped here or like you owe me something you're not willing to give." Mary Beth set down her fork, her appetite suddenly diminished by the weight of uncertainty. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. "I mean really want. Men don't usually spend $5 on a woman without expecting something in return." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I want a partner," he said finally. "Someone to share the work and the responsibility of keeping this place running. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not forgiving. It takes two people working together to build something that lasts." "And that's all," Mary Beth pressed, needing to understand the boundaries of their arrangement. "That's all I expect," Jonas replied. "Anything else?" He paused, his eyes meeting hers across the rough wooden table. "Anything else would have to be your choice, made freely, without obligation or pressure. I'm not the kind of man who takes what isn't offered." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Mary Beth felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She'd been bracing herself for demands, for the kind of crude expectations that had been in the eyes of the other bidders yesterday. Instead, she was being offered something she'd never had before: respect. "What about the baby?" she asked, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "What about it? When it comes, it won't be yours. It'll be a constant reminder of—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "A constant reminder of what?" Jonas's voice was still gentle, but there was an edge of steel underneath. "That you trusted the wrong person, that you got taken advantage of by a man who should have protected you instead of hurting you." Mary Beth stared at him in shock. No one had ever framed her situation in those terms before. Everyone in town, including her own father, had made it clear that her pregnancy was the result of her own moral failing, her own weakness and sin. "It's not your fault," Jonas continued, his pale eyes burning with quiet intensity. "Whatever happened to you, whatever lies that bastard told you to get what he wanted, it's not your fault. And any child born of it is innocent. Children don't choose how they come into this world, but they deserve love and protection once they're here." Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks before she could stop them. She'd carried the weight of shame and guilt for so long that she'd forgotten it was possible to see her situation any other way. To hear this near stranger speak of her child as innocent, as deserving of love, was almost more than she could bear. "Hey," Jonas said softly, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," Mary Beth managed through her tears. "It's just, no one's ever said that before, about it not being my fault." Jonas's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "Then no one in that town has a lick of sense or decency." They finished breakfast in a more companionable silence, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them. When the dishes were cleared, Jonas showed Mary Beth around the cabin, explaining the layout and the daily routines that kept the place running. The main room served as kitchen dining area and sitting room, with the massive fireplace providing heat for the entire structure. The loft where she'd slept was cozy but spacious enough for privacy. Behind the cabin was a well-organized workshop where Jonas crafted furniture and tools, and beyond that a root cellar dug deep into the hillside for storing food through the winter. "The barn's where I keep Thunder and the milk cow," Jonas explained as they walked the perimeter of the small homestead. "There's chickens in the coop, and I've got traps set along the creek for fish and small game. We're pretty self-sufficient up here, but it takes work to stay that way." Mary Beth absorbed all of this information, trying to imagine herself as part of this carefully constructed life. It was so different from the cramped, chaotic existence she'd known in town, where everything depended on the whims of other people and the fluctuations of the market. "What do you do when you need supplies you can't make or grow?" she asked. "Trip to town twice a year, spring and fall. Sometimes I trade with the Ute band that passes through in summer. They're good people, despite what you might have heard. And there's a few other mountain men scattered through these peaks." We help each other out when needed." The mention of Indians sent a small shiver of fear through Mary Beth. She'd heard stories all her life about savage tribes that murdered settlers and stole women and children, but Jonas spoke of them with casual familiarity, as if they were simply neighbors rather than mortal enemies. "Are they dangerous?" she asked. Jonas considered the question seriously. "Any people can be dangerous if you give them reason to be, but the Ute have been fair with me. I helped one of their young men a few years back when he got injured in a hunting accident, and Chief Running Bear considers me a friend now. They leave me alone, and I return the favor." As they walked back toward the cabin, Mary Beth found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving. The valley was breathtakingly beautiful in the daylight, with snow-capped peaks rising all around like the walls of a natural cathedral. The air was so clean and pure that each breath felt like a blessing, and the silence was profound without being oppressive. "It's peaceful here," she said, surprising herself with the observation. "That it is," Jonas agreed. "Took me a while to get used to the quiet after." He trailed off, and Mary Beth sensed she was approaching another piece of his carefully guarded past. "After what?" Jonas stopped walking and turned to look at the mountains surrounding them, his expression distant. "After the war, I was at Gettysburg, among other places. After you've heard that much death and destruction, silence feels like a gift." Mary Beth had heard stories about the Great Battle, of course. Every family in their part of Colorado had been touched by the war in some way, though the fighting had seemed like something happening in another world entirely. She tried to imagine Jonas as a young soldier facing the horrors that had broken so many men. "Is that why you came to the mountains?" she asked gently. "Part of it." Jonas started walking again, his long strides eating up the ground. "War changes a man, makes it hard to fit into the world he left behind. Up here, the only rules are the ones nature sets, and those make sense. Kill or be killed, prepare for winter, or freeze, work hard, or starve. Simple." Mary Beth thought about the complex web of social expectations and moral judgments that had governed her life in town, the endless scrutiny and whispered gossip that had made every day a trial. The idea of living by simpler, more honest rules was appealing in a way she hadn't expected. They spent the rest of the morning working together, Jonas showing Mary Beth how to care for the animals while he tended to various maintenance tasks around the homestead. She found the physical work satisfying in a way that the endless rounds of social calls and church functions had never been. There was a clear purpose to everything they did, a direct connection between effort and survival that made each task feel meaningful. The milk cow, a placid brown creature named Bessie, seemed to accept Mary Beth, immediately standing patiently while she learned the rhythm of milking. The chickens were more suspicious, but they tolerated her presence as long as she brought grain for them to peck at. "You're a natural at this," Jonas observed, watching her scatter feed for the birds. "Most city folk are afraid of anything that doesn't come wrapped in paper." "I'm not really city folk," Mary Beth replied. "My mother grew up on a farm before she married my father. She taught me about animals before she died." "What happened to her?" "Fever when I was 13. After that, it was just me and my father, and he was—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like self-pity. "He was a different man after she was gone, harder, angrier." Jonas nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen how grief could poison a person. "Some folks don't know how to handle loss. They let it eat them up from the inside, make them mean." "Is that what happened to you?" Mary Beth asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't pry." "It's all right." Jonas leaned against the barn wall, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose it did for a while. Lost a lot of good friends in the war, saw things no man should have to see. When I came home, everything felt small, pointless. The things people worried about, the way they spent their days, none of it seemed to matter after what I'd been through." "So you came here?" "So I came here. Figured if I was going to be alone with my ghosts, I might as well do it somewhere beautiful." The honesty in his words touched something deep in Mary Beth's chest. She'd felt that same disconnection from the world around her, that sense of living on the outside of everyone else's reality. Her experience was different from his, but the isolation was familiar. "Do you still feel that way?" she asked. "Alone with your ghosts?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "Less so lately," he said finally, "especially since yesterday." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Mary Beth felt that strange shifting sensation in her chest again, as if something fundamental was changing inside her. There was something in Jonas's expression, not desire exactly, but recognition, as if he saw something in her that no one else had ever noticed. The moment was broken by a distant howl echoing down from the mountains above them. Jonas straightened immediately, his whole body going alert in a way that reminded Mary Beth of a wolf scenting danger. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how far from any help. "Probably nothing," Jonas said, but his hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Could be wolves, or maybe a bear that got woken up early from winter sleep. But we should get back to the cabin anyway." As they walked back across the clearing, Mary Beth found herself acutely aware of the wilderness surrounding them. Yesterday, the isolation of the valley had felt like protection, a barrier between her and the judgment of the outside world. Now she realized it was also a barrier between them and any kind of help should they need it. "Jonas," she said as they reached the cabin door, "what happens if there's trouble up here? If someone gets hurt or if there's danger?" "Then we handle it ourselves," he replied simply. "That's the price of living free. You can't count on anyone else to save you." The words should have been frightening, but instead Mary Beth found them oddly comforting. After a lifetime of depending on other people's goodwill and protection, the idea of being self-sufficient was appealing. She might not know how to handle mountain dangers yet, but she could learn. Inside the cabin, Jonas moved to the window and stood looking out at the valley with the focused attention of a man who knew how to read the signs of approaching trouble. Mary Beth watched him, noting the way he seemed to blend with the shadows, becoming part of the landscape rather than standing apart from it. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. "Always," Jonas replied without turning around. "The mountains are full of dangers, some human and some not. A smart man stays ready for both." As if summoned by his words, another howl echoed through the valley, closer this time and answered by several others. Mary Beth moved to the window beside Jonas, peering out at the tree line where shadows moved between the trunks. "Wolves," she whispered. "Yeah, but they're not hunting. That's a greeting call, not a challenge." Jonas relaxed slightly, though he remained alert. Probably just passing through on their way to better hunting grounds. Sure enough, after a few more minutes, a small pack of wolves emerged from the trees at the far end of the valley. Even at a distance, Mary Beth could see they were magnificent creatures, their gray and black coats gleaming in the afternoon sun as they moved with fluid grace across the snow. "They're beautiful," she breathed, surprised by her own reaction. She'd expected to feel fear, but instead she was filled with wonder at the sight of such wild, free creatures. "That they are," Jonas agreed. "Most people see them as nothing but killers, but they're just trying to survive like everything else up here. They have their place in the order of things." The wolves paused at the creek to drink their leader, a massive gray male with intelligent yellow eyes, lifting his head to look directly at the cabin. For a moment, Mary Beth felt as if he was studying them, taking their measure just as Jonas had taught her to assess potential threats. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the pack moved on, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side of the valley, like ghosts made of mist and shadow. "Will they come back?" Mary Beth asked. "Maybe. Depends on what they find up in the high country, but they won't bother us unless we give them reason to. Wolves are smart. They know humans mean trouble." As evening approached, Jonas began preparing dinner while Mary Beth explored the cabin more thoroughly. She found shelves lined with books, an eclectic collection that included everything from Shakespeare to practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry. There were also journals filled with Jonas's careful handwriting documenting weather patterns, animal migrations, and the changing seasons in the high country. "You're educated," she observed, running her fingers along the spine of a volume of poetry. "My mother was a school teacher before she married my father," Jonas replied from the kitchen. "She made sure I could read and write before I was old enough to help with the farm work. Said a man without learning was only half a man." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. "Died when I was 16, just before I enlisted. Sometimes I wonder what she'd think of the way I've chosen to live." Mary Beth heard the note of uncertainty in his voice and turned to study his profile as he worked. "I think she'd be proud," she said quietly. "You've built something good here, something honest. That takes strength and wisdom." Jonas glanced at her over his shoulder, and she saw surprise in his pale eyes, as if he wasn't used to receiving such straightforward praise. "Thank you," he said simply. As they ate dinner by the light of the fire, Mary Beth found herself sharing stories from her own childhood memories of her mother's garden, the songs she used to sing while doing household chores, the way she'd made even the most mundane tasks feel special through her gentle presence. "She sounds like she was a good mother," Jonas said when Mary Beth finished describing one particularly vivid memory. "She was. I keep hoping I'll be half as good to my own child." Mary Beth's hand moved to her belly where the baby was beginning to show signs of movement. "I worry sometimes that I don't know enough, that I won't be strong enough to protect him or her the way a mother should." "Strength isn't just about fighting off danger," Jonas said thoughtfully. "It's about making hard choices, sacrificing for the people you love, standing up for what's right even when it costs you. From what I've seen, you've got that kind of strength in abundance." The conviction in his voice made Mary Beth's throat tighten with emotion. She'd spent so many months feeling weak and helpless, at the mercy of forces beyond her control. To hear this strong, capable man speak of her as if she possessed real strength was almost overwhelming. "I hope you're right," she said softly. "I am." Jonas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the contact warm and reassuring. "Trust me on this. I've seen enough people in crisis to know the difference between those who break and those who bend. You're a bender, not a breaker." That night, as Mary Beth settled into the loft bed, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 2 days ago, she'd been a disgraced woman facing an uncertain future. Now she was in a hidden valley with a man who saw strength, where others saw weakness, who spoke of her unborn child as a blessing rather than a burden. It was too much to hope that this feeling of safety and acceptance would last, but for now, it was enough. Outside, the wind whistled through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs to the stars. But inside the cabin, all was warm and peaceful, and for the first time in months, Mary Beth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The sound of Jonas moving around below was comforting rather than threatening, and she found herself listening to the quiet efficiency of his nighttime routine. He banked the fire, checked the door and windows, and settled onto the pile of furs he'd arranged near the hearth. There was something deeply reassuring about sharing space with someone so competent and careful, someone who took responsibility for their mutual safety without making her feel helpless or dependent. As sleep began to claim her, Mary Beth whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought Jonas Rohr into her life. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was looking forward to finding out. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Mary Beth with its contentment. Each morning brought new lessons as Jonas taught her the intricate skills needed to survive in the high country. She learned to read the sky for weather signs, to distinguish between the tracks of different animals in the snow, and to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter months ahead. Her pregnancy progressed without complication. The mountain air and regular work seeming to agree with both her and the child she carried. Jonas was unfailingly considerate of her condition, adjusting their daily routines to accommodate her growing fatigue and the physical limitations that came with her advancing pregnancy. "You don't have to treat me like I'm made of glass," she told him one afternoon as he insisted on carrying a bucket of water she was perfectly capable of managing herself. "I'm not," Jonas replied, but there was a gentleness in his pale eyes that suggested otherwise. "I'm treating you like a woman who's doing important work growing a human being. That takes energy and strength, and there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." It was a far cry from her father's attitude, which had been that her pregnancy was her own problem to manage without inconveniencing anyone else. The contrast made her appreciate Jonas's consideration even more, though she was careful not to take advantage of his protective instincts. As March gave way to April, the snow began to retreat from the lower elevations of the valley, revealing patches of dark earth and the first tentative shoots of spring grass. Mary Beth felt her spirits lift with the changing season, as if the promise of new life all around them was somehow connected to the new beginning she was creating for herself and her child. It was during one of these bright spring mornings that their peaceful routine was shattered by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Mary Beth was hanging laundry on the line Jonas had strung between two pine trees when she heard Thunder's warning whinny from the pasture. The stallion's head was up, his ears pricked forward as he stared toward the narrow passage that led into the valley. "Jonas," she called, her voice carrying the note of alarm that months in the wilderness had taught her to recognize. He appeared from the workshop within seconds, moving with the fluid speed that still amazed her. His rifle was in his hands, and his eyes were already scanning the tree line for signs of trouble. "How many?" he asked quietly, not bothering to question her instinct for danger. "I don't know. Thunder sees something, but I can't tell what." Jonas studied the passage entrance for a long moment, then nodded toward the cabin. "Inside. Stay away from the windows." Mary Beth wanted to protest that she could help, but one look at Jonas's expression told her this wasn't the time for arguments. She gathered the laundry quickly and hurried into the cabin, taking up a position where she could see out without being easily spotted from outside. The minutes stretched like hours as they waited. Then faintly, Mary Beth heard the sound of horses picking their way carefully down the rocky trail that led into the valley. Multiple horses, which meant multiple riders, and anyone who could navigate that treacherous passage had to know where they were going. "Jonas, roar!" a voice called out across the valley, echoing off the surrounding peaks. "It's Deputy Marshal Williams. I'm coming in under a flag of truce." Mary Beth saw Jonas's shoulders relax slightly, but he didn't lower his rifle. "What brings you to my valley, Williams?" he called back. "Official business. I've got some men with me, but we're not looking for trouble. Any man who comes into my valley armed is looking for trouble, whether he admits it or not." There was a pause, then the sound of voices conferring in low tones. Finally, Williams called out again. "We're here about the woman, the one you took from town." Mary Beth's blood turned to ice. She'd known this moment might come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality of facing whatever legal or social consequences awaited her was still terrifying. Jonas's voice, when he replied, was deadly calm. "The woman came with me of her own free will. You've got no business with her. That's not what her father says. He's filed a complaint, claims you kidnapped her. Her father sold her like a piece of livestock. Any judge worth the title would laugh him out of court." The conversation continued across the valley, but Mary Beth could no longer make out the individual words over the pounding of her heart. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as if the child could sense her distress. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Jonas approaching the cabin. He entered quietly, his face grim but not panicked. "What do they want?" she asked. "To take you back to town for questioning. Your father's claiming I forced you to come with me, that you're being held against your will." Mary Beth felt a surge of bitter anger. Even now, even after everything that had happened, Harlan was trying to control her life. He just wants his money back, doesn't he? He thinks if he can get me returned like defective merchandise, he can sell me to someone else. Probably, Jonas agreed. But that's not going to happen. What if they have legal authority? What if they can force me to go back? Jonas was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes troubled. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But first, I want to hear exactly what they're claiming and what proof they think they have. He moved to the window and called out to the waiting men. Williams, if you want to talk, you can come up to the cabin, but only you, and you leave your weapons with your men. Another pause, then Williams replied, All right, but I want to see the woman, make sure she's unharmed. She's fine. You can see for yourself. Mary Beth watched from the window as a single rider separated from the group and made his way across the valley floor. Deputy Marshal Williams was a thin, nervous-looking man in his 40s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He kept glancing around the valley as if expecting an ambush, clearly uncomfortable in the wilderness setting. Jonas opened the cabin door as Williams approached, but he remained in the doorway with his rifle prominently displayed. That's close enough, he said when the deputy was still 20 feet away. Say your piece. Williams dismounted and approached on foot, his hands carefully visible and empty. Mr. Rohr, I'm here on official business. We've received a complaint that you abducted Miss Briggs against her will and are holding her prisoner. And who filed this complaint? Her father, Harlan Briggs. He says his daughter was coerced into leaving with you, that she was in no condition to make rational decisions due to her condition. Mary Beth stepped into the doorway beside Jonas, her chin raised defiantly. Deputy Williams, I remember you from town. You know me well enough to judge whether I'm being held prisoner. Williams looked genuinely relieved to see her apparently unharmed. Miss Briggs, I'm glad to see you're well, but I have to ask, are you here of your own free will? Has this man threatened you or forced you to stay against your wishes? I came here because it was my choice, Mary Beth said firmly. Mr. Rohr has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. If anyone threatened or coerced me, it was my own father when he put me on that auction block like a piece of property. William shifted uncomfortably. Now, Miss Briggs, I understand your father was trying to secure your future given your circumstances. Perhaps the arrangement wasn't ideal, but the arrangement was slavery. Jonas interrupted, his voice cold as winter wind. And if you think there's anything legal or decent about a man selling his pregnant daughter to the highest bidder, then you're not fit to wear that badge. Now see here. No, you see here. Jonas stepped forward and Williams instinctively backed away from the barely controlled anger radiating from the mountain man. That woman was treated like chattel put on display for a bunch of men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and used. If you want to arrest someone for what happened that day, start with Harlan Briggs. Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly realizing that the situation was more complicated than he'd been led to believe. Even so, there are proper procedures. Miss Briggs should return to town to make her statement to clear up any misunderstandings. What misunderstandings? Mary Beth demanded. That I chose to leave with a man who offered me safety and respect, instead of staying to be sold to the next highest bidder, that I preferred the company of someone who treats me like a human being instead of damaged goods. Your father says you weren't thinking clearly, that your condition affected your judgment. My condition is pregnancy, not insanity, Mary Beth snapped. I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions, and I made them. If my father has a problem with that, he can take it up with me directly, instead of sending the law to drag me back like a runaway slave. Williams looked from Mary Beth to Jonas, and back again, clearly seeing that whatever he'd expected to find here, it wasn't a woman being held against her will. But he also had his orders, and backing down now would mean admitting he'd been sent on a fool's errand. I'm afraid I still need to ask you to return to town, Miss Briggs. just to make an official statement clear everything up legal-like. You can come back here afterward if that's what you choose. No, Jonas said flatly. She's not going anywhere with you. Mr. Rohr, I appreciate your concern for the lady, but this is official business. I have the authority to compel her cooperation if necessary. The temperature in the valley seemed to drop 10 degrees as Jonas fixed Williams with a stare that could have frozen fire. You're welcome to try, he said softly, but I should mention that this valley is on my property, legally purchased and registered with the territorial government. That makes you trespassers, and mountain law gives me the right to defend my land and my family against unwanted intruders. Family, Williams repeated, latching onto the word. Miss Briggs is under my protection, Jonas clarified. That makes her family as far as I'm concerned. Mary Beth felt a warm surge of gratitude at the simple declaration. In all her life, no one had ever claimed her as family with such certainty and conviction. Williams was clearly in over his head, faced with a situation his superiors hadn't prepared him for. Look, I don't want trouble, but I've got my orders, and he was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the direction of his men, followed by shouts of alarm and the frightened whinnying of horses. Jonas grabbed his rifle and was moving before the echoes died away, with Mary Beth close behind, despite his sharp command for her to stay in the cabin. At the edge of the valley, chaos reigned. Williams's men were scattered, some trying to control their spooked horses, while others fired wildly at shapes moving through the trees. It took Mary Beth a moment to realize what they were shooting at: a band of Ute warriors who had apparently been observing the proceedings from concealment. "Cease fire!" Jonas roared, his voice carrying across the valley with startling authority. "Cease fire, you idiots!" But the damage was already done. One of the warriors lay motionless among the rocks, and Mary Beth could see blood staining the snow around him. The remaining Utes had taken cover, but their war cries echoed off the canyon walls, promising retribution for their fallen comrade. "Running Bear!" Jonas called out in what Mary Beth realized must be the Ute language. The words were harsh and guttural, but his tone was clearly one of urgent negotiation rather than challenge. A voice answered from the rocks, angry and accusatory. Jonas replied in the same language, his hands spread wide in a gesture of peace. The conversation continued for several tense minutes while Williams and his men huddled together, clearly terrified by the situation they'd stumbled into. Finally, a tall figure emerged from the rocks, a man in his 50s with graying braids and the bearing of natural authority. His face was painted for war, and his eyes burned with controlled fury as he surveyed the scene. "Running Bear," Jonas said, switching to English as he approached the chief. "This was not my doing. These men came here without my permission." "Your valley, your responsibility," Running Bear replied, his English heavily accented but clear. "My nephew is dead because you bring soldiers to sacred hunting grounds." "I know, and I'm sorry for your loss, but these men aren't soldiers. They're lawmen from the town here on civilian business. They didn't know your people were here." Running Bear's gaze shifted to Mary Beth, taking in her obvious pregnancy and the protective way Jonas positioned himself between her and potential danger. "The woman carries new life," he observed, "yet these men would take her from safety." "They would," Jonas confirmed. "Her own father sold her like a horse, and now he wants her returned so he can sell her again." The chief's expression darkened further. "White man's ways," he said with disgust. "No honor, no respect for the sacred bond between parent and child." Williams, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Now see here, we didn't know there were Indians in the area. This was just supposed to be a simple legal matter." Running Bear turned his attention to the deputy, and Williams actually took a step backward from the intensity of that stare. "Simple," the chief repeated. "My nephew's death is simple matter. That is, we didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. My men thought they were under attack." Your men are fools who shoot first and ask questions later, Jonas said harshly. They violated Ute hunting grounds and spilled blood on sacred land, under tribal law that demands justice. Mary Beth could see Williams beginning to panic as he realized the full scope of what had happened. What was supposed to be a routine retrieval had turned into a potential massacre, and he was completely out of his depth. What kind of justice? Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Running Bear and Jonas exchanged a long look, and Mary Beth had the distinct impression that some kind of wordless communication was taking place between them. Finally, the chief spoke. Blood debt must be paid, he said simply. But Mountain Walker speaks truth. This was not his doing. The woman carries life, and she has chosen her path freely. We will not pursue blood from them. What about us? Williams asked. That depends, Running Bear replied. You leave now, never return to this valley and tell no one of our presence here. Do this and we consider the matter closed. But if any of you speak of what happened today, if you bring more soldiers to our hunting grounds, then blood debt will be collected in full. Williams looked around at his men, seeing the same fear in their faces that must have been written on his own. The idea of returning to town and reporting failure was unpleasant, but the alternative was clearly worse. We'll go, he said quickly, right now, and we won't say anything about any of this. See that you don't, Jonas said, and Williams, if anyone else comes looking for Miss Briggs, you make sure they understand that she's under the protection of both mountain law and tribal authority. Anyone who wants to challenge that is welcome to try, but they'd better come prepared for war. The deputy nodded frantically, clearly eager to be gone from this place where simple legal matters turned into life-and-death confrontations. Within minutes, his men were mounted and riding hard for the passage that led out of the valley, leaving behind the body of the young Ute warrior as silent testimony to the price of ignorance and aggression. Running Bear stood over his nephew's body for a long moment, his weathered face etched with grief. Then he looked up at Jonas and Mary Beth, his expression softening slightly. You have made strong choice, white woman, he said to Mary Beth. Mountain Walker is good man, but life here is hard. You must be strong too. I will be, Mary Beth replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The chief nodded approvingly. New life brings hope. My people honor the sacred bond between mother and child. If you need help when your time comes, send word. Our medicine woman has delivered many babies, knows the old ways. With that, Running Bear and his remaining warriors gathered up their fallen comrade and disappeared into the forest as silently as they had appeared, leaving Jonas and Mary Beth alone in the valley once more. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Mary Beth sank down onto a fallen log, suddenly exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the morning. Is it over? She asked. Jonas sat beside her, his rifle across his knees, and his eyes still scanning the tree line for any sign of returning trouble. For now, he said, Williams won't be back, and word will get around town that bothering us means tangling with the Ute. Most folks aren't brave enough to risk that. But my father won't give up, Willie. He'll find another way to cause trouble. Maybe, but he'll have to be careful about it. Running Bear wasn't making idle threats. The Ute have long memories and they don't forgive easily. If Harlan tries to send more men up here, he might find himself dealing with problems a lot worse than a runaway daughter. Mary Beth leaned against Jonas's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry that knowing me has brought violence to your valley. Hey, Jonas tilted her chin up so she was looking into his pale blue eyes. This isn't your fault. You didn't ask to be sold like livestock, and you didn't ask for your father to be too stubborn to accept your choices. Don't take on guilt that belongs to other people. But that young man died because Williams's men were trigger-happy fools who shot first and asked questions later. The only person responsible for his death is the man who pulled the trigger. Mary Beth wanted to believe him, but the weight of guilt was hard to shake. It seemed like everywhere she went, violence and tragedy followed in her wake. "Stop it," Jonas said firmly, apparently reading her thoughts. "I can see you blaming yourself, and it needs to stop right now. You're not responsible for other people's choices, good or bad. All you can control is your own actions, and you've done nothing wrong." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen real evil, real corruption. I've seen what it looks like when someone chooses to hurt others for their own gain." "That's not you, Mary Beth. You're a good person who's been hurt by bad people, and there's a difference." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and Mary Beth found herself believing him despite her own doubts. There was something about Jonas that made it impossible to doubt his sincerity. When he spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between truth and lies. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go on with our lives," Jonas replied. "We prepare for winter, we get ready for your baby to be born, and we don't let fear of what might happen stop us from building something good here." As they walked back to the cabin, Mary Beth felt some of her earlier peace returning. The confrontation with Williams and the tragic death of the young warrior had been a stark reminder that the outside world could intrude on their sanctuary at any time. But it had also shown her that Jonas was willing to fight for her, to protect her and her unborn child, even against overwhelming odds. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a quiet dinner, Mary Beth found herself thinking about Running Bear's words. The chief had called Jonas Mountain Walker, a name that spoke of respect and recognition. It was clear that the Ute considered him more than just another white settler. He was someone who belonged in this wild country, someone who understood and respected the ancient rhythms of life in the high places. "Running Bear called you Mountain Walker," she said suddenly. Jonas looked up from his plate, a slight smile playing around the corners of his mouth. "That's the name they gave me when I first came here. Means someone who can move through the high country without disturbing the natural order, someone who belongs." "Do you belong here, I mean?" Jonas considered the question seriously. "More than I've ever belonged anywhere else," he said finally. "The mountains don't care about your past, don't judge you for your mistakes. They just ask that you respect them and be honest about what you are." "And what are you?" "A man who's found his place in the world," Jonas replied. Finally, Mary Beth felt a flutter of movement in her belly as the baby shifted position, reminding her of the new life growing within her. Soon, very soon, she would be a mother responsible for another human being's safety and happiness. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Jonas," she said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a chance to find my place too." He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused and completely steady. "Thank you for letting me." Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called to its mate. The valley settled into the peaceful quiet of night, but inside the cabin, two people sat by the fire and contemplated the future they were building together, one careful choice at a time. The peaceful weeks that followed the confrontation with Deputy Williams seemed almost too good to be true. Mary Beth found herself constantly waiting for the next crisis, the next threat to their fragile sanctuary, but none came. The valley settled into the rhythm of late spring, with wildflowers blooming in hidden meadows, and the creek running high with snowmelt from the peaks above. Her pregnancy had progressed to the point where simple tasks became increasingly difficult. At 8 months, she could no longer see her own feet, and climbing the ladder to the loft required Jonas's assistance. But rather than making her feel helpless, these changes seemed to bring out a protective tenderness in Jonas that touched her heart daily. "You don't have to hover," she told him one morning as he insisted on helping her down the ladder yet again. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years without this much fussing." "Not my women," Jonas replied simply, and the casual possessiveness in his voice sent a warm shiver through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. It was mid-May when the next blow fell, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. Mary Beth was working in the garden, carefully tending the seedlings Jonas had started in the cabin during the last weeks of winter when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching through the valley. Her first instinct was alarm. Visitors to their hidden sanctuary were rare and usually meant trouble, but this rider was making no attempt at stealth or concealment. Jonas emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness, his rifle in hand, but not raised threateningly. The approaching rider was alone, elderly, and wearing the dusty black clothes of a traveling preacher. As he drew closer, Mary Beth could see that he was probably in his 60s, with iron gray hair and the weather-beaten face of a man who'd spent years on the frontier. "Hello, the cabin," the stranger called out when he was still 50 yards away. "I'm looking for Jonas Rohr and Mary Beth Briggs. I come with important news." Jonas stepped forward, his body language wary but not hostile. "I'm Rohr. State your business." The preacher dismounted and approached on foot, his hands clearly visible and empty. "Reverend Samuel Morrison, recently of Denver," he introduced himself. "I've ridden a long way to find you folks, and I'm afraid the news I bring isn't good." Mary Beth felt her heart sink. After months of peace, she'd begun to hope that the outside world had forgotten about them entirely. Now it seemed that hope had been premature. "What kind of news?" Jonas asked. Morrison looked from Jonas to Mary Beth, his weathered face grave. "Legal news, I'm afraid. There's been developments in town regarding Miss Briggs's situation, developments that could affect both of you." "What kind of developments?" Mary Beth stepped forward, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The preacher's expression softened as he took in her obvious pregnancy. "Your father has been busy since Deputy Williams returned from his visit here. He's convinced the territorial judge that you were coerced into leaving town, that you're being held against your will by a man of questionable character." Jonas's jaw tightened dangerously. "Questionable character." "I'm sorry, Mr. Rohr, but I'm only reporting what I've heard. Harlan Briggs has painted you as a dangerous mountain man who preys on vulnerable women. He's claimed that his daughter was not of sound mind when she left with you, that her pregnancy affected her judgment and made her susceptible to manipulation." Mary Beth felt a surge of familiar anger at her father's continued attempts to control her life. "That's ridiculous. I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions." "I believe you, miss. But the law is more complicated than simple truth sometimes. Your father has also made another claim, one that could be much more serious." "What claim?" Jonas's voice was deadly quiet. Morrison hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver his message. "He's alleged that you are not legally entitled to claim Miss Briggs as your wife, or to claim her unborn child as your own. He's petitioned the court to declare any marriage between you invalid on the grounds that it was not properly witnessed or recorded." The words hit like a physical blow. Mary Beth felt the color drain from her face as the implications sank in. She and Jonas had never actually married. Their arrangement had been practical rather than romantic, based on mutual need and respect rather than love. But if the court ruled that they had no legal relationship, she would be considered an unmarried woman living in sin, and her child would be declared illegitimate. "There's more," Morrison continued reluctantly. "Your father has also entered into an agreement with the Colorado and Southern Railroad. They're planning to build a spur line through this region, and they've identified your valley as a key location for a depot and switching yard." Jonas's face went pale. "This is my land. I have a legal deed registered with the territorial government." "Yes, but the railroad has powerful friends in Denver and Washington. They're claiming the right of eminent domain, saying that your property is needed for the greater good of territorial development. If the court rules in their favor, you could be forced to sell at whatever price they choose to pay." Mary Beth sank onto the chopping block Jonas used for splitting kindling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. It wasn't enough that her father wanted to drag her back to town and sell her to the highest bidder. Now he was threatening to destroy the only real home she'd ever known. "Why?" she whispered. "Why won't he just leave us alone?" Morrison's expression was sympathetic. I suspect it's about more than just paternal concern, miss. There are rumors that your father has gotten himself deep into debt with some very dangerous people, the kind of people who don't accept excuses when it comes time to collect what they're owed. So he's using us to solve his financial problems, Jonas said grimly, selling his daughter to the railroad in exchange for enough money to pay off his gambling debts. It appears so. I'm told the railroad has offered him a substantial finder's fee for helping them identify strategic properties in the high country. Your valley, with its natural shelter and access to water, is exactly what they need for their operations. Mary Beth felt sick with betrayal and rage. Her own father was willing to destroy her happiness and security to save himself from the consequences of his own poor choices. It was exactly the kind of selfish, short-sighted thinking that had characterized his entire approach to parenting. What's the timeline? Jonas asked. How long do we have? The court hearing is scheduled for next month, Morrison replied. Both of you are required to appear to answer the charges and defend your right to remain here. If you fail to appear, the court will rule in your father's favor by default. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the distant peaks that surrounded their valley. Mary Beth could practically see him calculating options, weighing risks, planning their response to this new threat. There's something else, Morrison said quietly. Something that might help if you're willing to consider it. What? Mary Beth asked. A proper marriage ceremony. If you and Mr. Rohr were to wed in a legally recognized ceremony with proper witnesses and documentation, it would strengthen your position considerably. The court would have a much harder time claiming that your relationship is invalid or that Mr. Rohr has no legal standing to protect you and your child. Mary Beth felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The suggestion was practical and logical, but it also highlighted the awkward nature of her relationship with Jonas. They lived together, worked together, and cared for each other, but they had never discussed marriage in any serious way. That's assuming Miss Briggs would be willing, Jonas said carefully. Marriage is a serious commitment, not something to be entered into lightly just for legal convenience. Of course, Morrison agreed, but I should mention that time is of the essence. The closer you get to the birth of your child, the more the court will be inclined to rule in favor of what they perceive as stability and traditional family structure. Mary Beth looked up at Jonas, trying to read his expression. His face was carefully neutral, giving no indication of his own feelings about the prospect of marriage. She realized that in all their months together, they had never discussed the possibility of making their arrangement permanent. Could you give us some time to discuss this? She asked Morrison. Of course, I'll be camping by the creek tonight. You can give me your answer in the morning. As the preacher led his horse away to make camp, Mary Beth and Jonas stood in uncomfortable silence. The easy companionship they'd developed over the past months suddenly felt fragile and uncertain, complicated by the weight of expectations and legal necessities. We should talk, Jonas said finally. They walked to the cabin in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Inside, Jonas busied himself with building up the fire while Mary Beth settled into her favorite chair, trying to organize her chaotic emotions. What are you thinking? Jonas asked, when the fire was crackling cheerfully. That I'm tired of other people trying to control my life, Mary Beth replied honestly. My father, the court, the railroad, everyone seems to think they know what's best for me better than I do. And what do you think is best for you? Mary Beth considered the question seriously. Over the months they'd spent together, she'd come to care for Jonas deeply. He was kind, protective, hardworking, and honest. Everything that Ezekiel Hawthorne had pretended to be, but wasn't. But did caring translate into the kind of love that marriage should be based on? I think, she said slowly, that I've been happier here with you than I've ever been anywhere else. I think you're a good man who deserves better than being forced into marriage by legal necessity. And I think my child couldn't ask for a better father figure regardless of biology. Jonas sat down across from her, his expression serious. Mary Beth, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we get married, it won't be just for legal protection. Once I make that commitment, it's permanent. I don't believe in divorce or abandonment. If you become my wife, you'll be my wife for life through whatever comes. The intensity in his voice made her shiver. And if I can't, if I'm not able to be a real wife to you, if the marriage is just on paper, then that's what it is. I won't pressure you for anything you're not ready to give freely. But I also won't pretend that I don't care about you, that this is just a business arrangement. Mary Beth felt her heart skip a beat at the quiet admission. You care about me. Jonas leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. Mary Beth, I've cared about you since the moment I saw you standing on that platform trying to be brave, while the whole world treated you like you were nothing. I've watched you work harder than any woman should have to work, seen you face down dangers that would break most people, and you've done it all with a grace and strength that amazes me every day. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Mary Beth felt tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that this strong, capable man had been watching her just as carefully as she'd been watching him. I care about you too, she whispered. More than I probably should given our circumstances. Why shouldn't you? Because I'm damaged goods, remember. A fallen woman carrying another man's child. I have nothing to offer a man like you except problems and complications. Jonas was across the room and kneeling beside her chair before she could blink, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. Don't you ever say that again, he said fiercely. You're not damaged, you're not fallen, and you're not worthless. You're a strong, beautiful woman who's survived things that would have destroyed weaker people. Any man would be lucky to have you as his wife. Even with the baby, especially with the baby, that child is part of you, which makes him or her part of what I care about. I meant what I said before. I'll raise this baby as my own, love him or her as my own, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. Mary Beth searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or reservation, but found only sincerity and determination. This man, this mountain giant, who could have had his pick of unmarried women in a dozen towns, was offering to tie his life permanently to hers, to take on her burdens as his own. Are you proposing to me, Jonas Rohr? She asked softly. A slow smile spread across his weathered features. I suppose I am, Mary Beth Briggs. Will you marry me, not because the law says we should not, because it's convenient or practical, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life taking care of you and making you happy? The simple words hit her like a lightning bolt. Love. He loved her. This incredible man who had rescued her from a nightmare and given her a new life actually loved her. Yes. She breathed, hardly believing she was saying the words. Yes, I'll marry you, because I love you too, and because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Jonas kissed her, then soft and gentle and full of promise. It was nothing like the brutal assault Ezekiel Hawthorne had called affection. This was tender and respectful, and everything a first kiss should be. When they finally broke apart, Mary Beth felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked the same, but somehow felt completely different. She was going to be Jonas's wife, really and truly, not just for legal protection, but for love. We should tell Morrison, Jonas said, though he seemed reluctant to break the spell of the moment. In a minute, Mary Beth replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. Let me just enjoy this for a little while first. They sat together by the fire as darkness fell outside, talking quietly about their plans for the future. Jonas told her about improvements he wanted to make to the cabin, about expanding the barn and building a proper schoolhouse for their children. Mary Beth found herself imagining those children, some that would look like Jonas with his pale eyes and dark hair, others that might favor her own softer features. Jonas, she said, suddenly struck by a troubling thought. What if the court doesn't recognize our marriage anyway? What if they say it doesn't count because it wasn't performed in a church or because Morrison isn't licensed in this territory? Jonas considered this soberly. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Morrison seems to know what he's talking about, and he wouldn't have suggested marriage if he thought it wouldn't help. You're right. I'm just scared, I guess. Scared that just when everything seems to be working out, it'll all be taken away again. Hey, Jonas tilted her chin up so she was looking into his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. We'll fight this together, whatever it takes. The conviction in his voice steadied her nerves. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't be facing them alone. The next morning they found Morrison already awake and tending to his horse. The preacher looked up as they approached his experienced eyes, taking in their joined hands and the subtle changes in their demeanor. I take it you've reached a decision, he asked with a knowing smile. We have, Jonas replied. We'd like you to perform the ceremony as soon as possible. Morrison nodded approvingly. Excellent. I'll need to prepare some documentation to make sure everything is properly legal. Do you have any witnesses in mind? Mary Beth frowned. There's no one else here. Will that be a problem? Not necessarily. In frontier territories, the requirements are often relaxed due to practical necessity, but it would be better if we could find at least one witness who could testify to the validity of the ceremony if needed. Jonas was quiet for a moment, then his face brightened. Running Bear, he said suddenly. The Ute chief I told you about. He considers himself my friend, and tribal testimony carries weight in territorial courts. Do you think he'd come? Mary Beth asked. Only one way to find out. Jonas disappeared into the cabin and emerged with what looked like a small piece of polished bone carved with intricate symbols. He walked to the edge of the valley and placed it on a prominent rock, then cupped his hands around his mouth and made a sound that was part whistle, part animal call. The cry echoed off the canyon walls and was answered almost immediately by a similar call from somewhere high above them. Within minutes, a lone figure appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, a young Ute warrior who raised his hand in greeting before disappearing again. Word will reach Running Bear by evening, Jonas explained. If he's willing to come, he'll be here by tomorrow morning. Morrison looked impressed. You have an unusual relationship with the local tribes. They're good people if you treat them with respect, Jonas replied. Something most white folks never bother to learn. As promised, Running Bear arrived the next morning, accompanied by 2 other warriors and an elderly woman whose lined face spoke of great wisdom and experience. The chief greeted Jonas warmly, clasping his arm in the manner of old friends. Mountain Walker calls and Running Bear answers, the chief said in his careful English. What brings such urgency? Jonas explained the situation quickly, outlining the legal threats they faced and their need for witnesses to a proper marriage ceremony. Running Bear listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he learned of the railroad's plans for the valley. White man's greed knows no bounds, he said finally. They see beauty and think only of how to destroy it for profit. But you have been friend to my people, Mountain Walker. We will help if we can. The elderly woman who Running Bear introduced as Wind in the Trees approached Mary Beth with gentle curiosity. She spoke rapidly in Ute and Running Bear translated. She says the child comes soon. She asks if you have help for the birthing time. Mary Beth shook her head. I was hoping to make it to town when the time came, but now... Wind in the Trees spoke again, reaching out to touch Mary Beth's belly with reverent hands. The baby responded to her touch, moving visibly under the fabric of Mary Beth's dress. She says the child is strong and healthy, Running Bear translated. She offers to stay and help with the birth if you wish. She has delivered many babies, knows the old ways that sometimes work better than white medicine. Mary Beth felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Tell her I would be honored by her help. Wind in the Trees smiled and nodded, then spoke again at length. Running Bear's translation was thoughtful. She says childbirth is sacred time when the veil between worlds grows thin. To be present at such moment is great privilege. She will prepare special medicine, sing the old songs that ease pain, and call healthy spirits to protect mother and child. Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with fascination, cleared his throat diplomatically. If we're ready, perhaps we should proceed with the ceremony. They gathered in the clearing in front of the cabin with the majestic peaks serving as a natural cathedral. Morrison opened his worn Bible and began to speak the ancient words that would bind Jonas and Mary Beth together as husband and wife. The ceremony was simple but profound, made more meaningful by the wild beauty of their surroundings and the mixed company of witnesses. Morrison spoke of love and commitment, of facing life's challenges together, of creating something greater than the sum of its parts. When it came time for vows, Jonas took Mary Beth's hands in his and spoke from the heart. Mary Beth, I promise to love you and protect you for as long as I draw breath. I promise to be a good father to your child and any children we might have together. I promise to stand beside you against whatever troubles come our way, and to make this valley a place where you and our family can flourish and be happy. Mary Beth's voice was steady despite her tears as she replied, Jonas, I promise to love you and support you through whatever life brings us. I promise to work beside you to build a good life in this beautiful place. I promise to trust you and respect you and be the kind of wife who makes you proud to have chosen me. Morrison pronounced them husband and wife as the sun reached its zenith overhead, and Jonas kissed his new bride with gentle reverence while their unlikely congregation cheered. Running Bear stepped forward and placed his hands on both their heads, speaking a blessing in Ute that needed no translation to convey its meaning. Wind in the trees produced a small pouch of herbs from her medicine bag and sprinkled them over the newlyweds, while chanting in a voice that seemed to harmonize with the wind in the pines. The sweet smoke rose into the clear mountain air, like incense carrying their vows up to whatever gods watched over such moments. As their guests prepared to depart, Running Bear pulled Jonas aside for a private word. The conversation was brief but intense, conducted in the mixture of English and Ute they used when discussing serious matters. What did he say? Mary Beth asked when Jonas returned to her side. He's going to have some of his warriors keep watch on the trails leading into the valley, Jonas replied grimly. If any large groups try to approach, we'll have advance warning. He also said that tribal law considers our marriage sacred now, protected by ancient custom. Anyone who tries to break it apart will answer to the Ute as well as to me. The weight of that protection was both comforting and sobering. Mary Beth realized that by marrying Jonas she had gained not just a husband, but an extended family of sorts, people who would fight to defend her right to happiness. As evening fell and they found themselves alone again for the first time as husband and wife, Mary Beth felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. The practical aspects of their relationship hadn't changed. They would still sleep separately, still maintain the respectful boundaries they'd established over the months of living together. But somehow everything felt different now, charged with new possibilities and deeper meaning. No regrets? Jonas asked as they sat by the fire sharing their first dinner as a married couple. None, Mary Beth replied without hesitation. You, only that it took us this long to get here. She smiled at that feeling, warm and cherished, in a way she'd never experienced before. Tomorrow they would begin preparing for the court battle that would determine their future, but tonight they were simply Jonas and Mary Beth Rohr, newlyweds, in a valley that had become their sanctuary. The baby kicked strongly as if celebrating along with them, and Mary Beth placed Jonas's hand on her belly so he could feel the movement. His expression of wonder and joy as he felt his stepchild's vigorous activity made her heart swell with love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, and that Mary Beth thought as she drifted off to sleep that night made all the difference in the world. The weeks following their marriage passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Morrison had departed with their legal documents, promising to file them immediately with the territorial court, but his warnings about the railroad's influence weighed heavily on both Jonas and Mary Beth. Every sunset brought them one day closer to the court hearing that would determine not just their future, but the fate of the valley itself. Mary Beth's pregnancy had reached the point where the baby could arrive any day. Wind in the trees had returned twice to check on her progress, bringing various herbs and preparations, while teaching Mary Beth breathing techniques and traditional methods for easing labor pains. The elderly Ute woman's presence was comforting her calm confidence, a stark contrast to Mary Beth's growing anxiety about giving birth so far from any doctor. The spirits say the child will come with the next storm. Wind in the trees announced during her most recent visit, her weathered hands moving expertly over Mary Beth's swollen belly. Strong child eager to breathe mountain air. Jonas had been making his own preparations, fashioning a cradle from pine wood and ensuring they had adequate supplies for the birthing. But Mary Beth could see the worry in his pale eyes whenever he thought she wasn't looking. The combination of impending fatherhood and the legal threats hanging over them was taking its toll on her normally unflappable husband. It was on a Tuesday morning in late June when their fragile peace was shattered once again. Mary Beth was hanging washing on the line, moving slowly and carefully due to her advanced pregnancy, when Thunder's warning whinny echoed across the valley. But this time the sound was different, sharper, more urgent, as if the stallion sensed something truly dangerous approaching. Jonas appeared from the workshop within seconds, his rifle in hand and his face grim. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts in matters of survival. "What is it?" Mary Beth asked, but she was already moving toward the cabin, one hand supporting her heavy belly. "Too many horses," Jonas replied tersely. "And they're not trying to be quiet about it." From inside the cabin, Mary Beth could hear the approaching riders now, not the careful, respectful approach Morrison had used, but the aggressive clatter of men who expected to be obeyed. Her heart sank as she recognized the implications. This wasn't a friendly visit or even a legal summons. This was a show of force. "Jonas, roar!" A voice boomed across the valley, echoing off the canyon walls with practiced authority. "This is Judge Cornelius Blackwood of the Territorial Court. You and the woman are to surrender yourselves immediately." Mary Beth felt the baby kick violently in response to her surge of adrenaline. Judge Blackwood's reputation had preceded him even to their remote valley. He was known as a man who could be bought and stayed, bought whose rulings invariably favored whoever had the deepest pockets. Jonas positioned himself at the window, his rifle trained on the approaching party. Mary Beth could see at least a dozen men, all armed, some wearing the badges of territorial marshals. But what made her blood run cold was the sight of her father riding among them, his face twisted with righteous indignation and barely concealed greed. "You have no jurisdiction here," Jonas called back. "This is private property, legally owned and registered." "Not anymore," Blackwood's voice carried a note of smug satisfaction. "By order of the territorial government, this land has been designated for railroad development under the doctrine of eminent domain. You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises." Mary Beth sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. They'd known this moment might come, but she'd held on to hope that their marriage and legal documentation would provide some protection. Now it seemed those hopes had been naive. "What about the court hearing?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "We were told we'd have a chance to defend our rights." Harlan Briggs spurred his horse forward, his face flushed with alcohol and triumph. "There's been no need for a hearing, girl. The judge has reviewed all the evidence and made his ruling. You're coming home where you belong, and this mountain savage is going to jail for kidnapping and corrupting a minor." "I'm not a minor," Mary Beth shouted back, fury overriding her fear. I'm a married woman making my own choices. Married. Blackwood's laughter was cruel and mocking. To a half-wild mountain man by some traveling preacher with questionable credentials. That's not a legal marriage, girl. That's a sham designed to circumvent the law. Jonas's jaw tightened dangerously, but his voice remained steady. Reverend Morrison is a licensed minister, and our marriage was properly witnessed. You have no legal authority to dissolve it. I have all the authority I need, Blackwood snapped. The railroad has documented this man's history of violence, his associations with hostile Indian tribes, his complete disregard for civilized law and order. No court in the territory would recognize a marriage between a decent Christian woman and a savage. The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Mary Beth could feel Jonas's barely controlled rage radiating from his position by the window. She'd seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the cold, calculating fury of a man pushed beyond his limits. You've got 1 hour, Blackwood repeated. After that, we're coming in, whether you surrender or not. And I promise you, mountain man, if you force us to take you by violence, you won't survive the experience. As the posse settled into position around the cabin, clearly prepared for a siege, Mary Beth felt a familiar tightening in her belly. At first, she attributed it to stress, but when the sensation came again stronger and more regular, she realized with growing alarm that her labor was beginning. Jonas, she whispered, her hand gripping his arm. The baby's coming. He turned to look at her, and she saw her own fear reflected in his pale eyes. Of all the times for this to happen with armed men surrounding their home and their future hanging in the balance, the timing couldn't have been worse. Are you sure? He asked quietly. Another contraction answered his question, stronger than the last, and accompanied by a rush of fluid that soaked through her dress. I'm sure, she gasped. Jonas's expression shifted, the cold anger replaced by fierce determination. Then we make our stand here, he said simply. No one is taking you anywhere until that baby is safely born. The next contraction was strong enough to make Mary Beth cry out, despite her attempts to remain quiet. Outside, she could hear Harlan's voice raised in drunken argument, with Judge Blackwood apparently disagreeing about the best way to handle the situation. She's having the baby, Jonas called out suddenly, his voice carrying across the valley. Whatever you plan to do, you'll have to wait until the child is born. That's not our problem, Blackwood shouted back. You should have thought of that before you decided to resist lawful authority. Any man who would endanger a woman in childbirth isn't fit to call himself civilized, Jonas replied, his contempt evident in every word. The argument that followed was heated but brief. Even corrupt judges had to be careful about public perception, and forcing a woman to travel while in active labor would create exactly the kind of scandal that could end a political career. You have until the child is born, Blackwood finally conceded. But the moment that baby draws breath, you're both under arrest. Mary Beth tried to process this information, but another contraction seized her with such intensity that everything else faded to background noise. The baby was coming faster than she'd expected for a first birth, and the combination of fear and physical pain was overwhelming. Jonas helped her to the bed they'd prepared in the main room, his hands gentle despite the armed men watching their every move through the windows. You're going to be fine, he murmured, though she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Wind in the trees said you were strong, that the baby was healthy. We just have to trust in that. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. Jonas proved to be a capable midwife despite his obvious nervousness, following the instructions Wind in the trees had given them and providing constant encouragement when Mary Beth felt like she couldn't continue. Outside, the posse maintained their vigil, but Mary Beth was dimly aware that their numbers had grown. More riders had arrived throughout the afternoon, and from the shouted conversation she could overhear, it seemed that word of their situation had spread throughout the territory. Push, Mary Beth, Jonas urged during what felt like the 100th contraction. I can see the head. Just a little more." With a final, overwhelming surge of effort, Mary Beth felt the baby slip free, followed immediately by the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, a lusty, indignant cry that announced the arrival of a new life into the world. "It's a boy," Jonas said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted the tiny, squirming form. "A perfect, healthy boy." Mary Beth reached for her son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the rush of love and protectiveness that filled her the moment she saw his face. He was small but obviously strong, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed far too wise for someone only minutes old. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. "Welcome to the world, little one." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the precious moment of peace. Through the window, Mary Beth could see Judge Blackwood dismounting, accompanied by several armed men and what looked like a doctor carrying a medical bag. "Time's up," Blackwood called out. "Send the woman and child out immediately, or we're coming in." Jonas stood slowly, his hand moving to the rifle he'd propped against the wall. "She's not going anywhere," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The child was just born. She needs time to recover." "The doctor will determine what she needs," Blackwood replied coldly. "And what she needs is proper medical care, not the ministrations of a mountain savage." The insult was clearly intended to provoke Jonas into doing something rash, but Mary Beth could see him fighting to maintain control. Starting a gunfight with their newborn son in the room would be the height of madness, but surrender would mean certain separation and probably imprisonment for Jonas. It was then that the sound of war cries echoed from the ridge above the valley, followed by the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through the air. The posse's horses began to panic as Ute warriors appeared as if by magic on the canyon walls, their painted faces and traditional weapons, a stark reminder that white law had no authority in the ancient hunting grounds of the mountain tribes. Running Bear's voice boomed across the valley, speaking in English, so there could be no misunderstanding. "Mountain Walker is under protection of the Ute Nation. Any man who threatens him or his family will answer to tribal justice." Blackwood looked up at the warriors surrounding his position, clearly calculating odds that had suddenly shifted dramatically against him. "This is territorial law business," he shouted. "The federal government has treaties with your people. You have no right to interfere. Treaties white men break when convenient." Running Bear replied with cold dignity. "But Ute law is older than your treaties, stronger than your courts. Mountain Walker saved life of Ute child, earned place among our people. His family is our family now." Mary Beth felt a surge of gratitude for the unexpected protection, but she also knew that the situation was rapidly spiraling toward violence. Men on both sides were armed and angry, and it would take very little to turn their valley into a battlefield. "Please," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "There's been enough violence already. If you want to talk, then talk. But let's do it like civilized people, not like animals fighting over territory." Judge Blackwood looked from the Ute warriors to Jonas and back again, clearly realizing that his position was far more precarious than he'd anticipated. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll talk. But I want guarantees that your Indian friends won't attack while we're negotiating." Running Bear spoke rapidly in Ute to his warriors, then nodded to Jonas. "We will keep peace as long as peace is kept with us. But first, shot fired, first threat made against Mountain Walker's family, and this valley becomes your grave." The negotiations that followed were tense and complicated, conducted partly in the clearing between the cabin and the posse's position, partly through shouted exchanges across the valley. Mary Beth remained inside with baby Samuel, listening to the arguments and counter-arguments while nursing her son and trying to regain her strength. The core of the dispute was legal, but the implications were deeply personal. Blackwood claimed that Mary Beth's marriage to Jonas was invalid, that she'd been coerced into the arrangement while not of sound mind, and that the child's welfare required her return to proper civilization. Jonas countered that the marriage was entirely legal, properly witnessed and documented, and that Mary Beth had made her choices freely and with full understanding of the consequences. "The woman can speak for herself," Running Bear interjected at one point. "Ute law says woman's voice most important in matters concerning her children. Let her say what she chooses." Mary Beth appeared in the cabin doorway. Samuel cradled in her arms, her hair loose around her shoulders, and her face still pale from childbirth, but her voice strong and clear. "I choose my husband," she said simply. "I choose this valley, this life, this family we've built together. My father sold me like livestock because he needed money to pay his debts. Judge Blackwood wants to drag me back to town because the railroad is paying him to clear this land. But nobody, not my father, not the court, not the railroad, has the right to make my choices for me." She paused, looking around at the assembled men with calm dignity. "I'm Mary Beth Rohr, now wife to Jonas and mother to Samuel. This is my home, these are my people, and I'm not leaving unless someone wants to explain to the territorial governor why they used armed force against a woman who just gave birth." The mention of the territorial governor clearly struck home. Blackwood might be corrupt, but he wasn't stupid, and the political implications of attacking a new mother were potentially career-ending. "The railroad has legal rights," he insisted, but with less conviction than before. "The railroad has influence and money," Jonas replied, "but that doesn't make their claims legal. I have a clear deed to this property filed and registered according to territorial law. If they want my land, they'll have to go through proper legal channels, not hired guns and corrupt judges." Running Bear stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of ancient authority. "In old days, white men came with treaties promised to respect Indian lands, honor boundaries, keep peace. But always, when white men find something they want, treaties become worthless paper. You say you have law, but your law changes when convenient for powerful men." He gestured toward the valley surrounding them, the towering peaks and pristine wilderness that had remained unchanged for countless generations. "This place is sacred to my people, part of hunting grounds our fathers' knew. Railroad comes here, brings noise and smoke and poison, destroys balance that has existed since world began. Ute Nation will not permit this desecration." The implications of that statement were clear to everyone present. The territorial government might be willing to override Jonas's property rights, but taking on the Ute Nation was a far more serious proposition, one that could easily escalate into the kind of full-scale Indian war that would bring unwanted federal attention. Blackwood conferred quietly with his men for several minutes, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he stepped forward with the expression of a man who'd been forced to accept an unsatisfactory compromise. "Very well," he said. "We'll return to town and file a proper appeal through appropriate legal channels. But this matter isn't settled, Mountain Man. The railroad wants this land, and they have the resources to keep fighting until they get it." "Let them fight," Jonas replied calmly. "But they'll do it in court, according to law, not through intimidation and illegal seizure." As the posse prepared to depart, Harlan Briggs made one last desperate attempt to regain control of his daughter. "Mary Beth, girl, you're making a terrible mistake. Come home with me now and we can work this out properly." Mary Beth looked at her father with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I am home," she said quietly, "and I'm not your property to be worked out. Goodbye, Father." The finality in her voice seemed to break something in Harlan's spirit. He aged visibly as he realized that his daughter was truly lost to him, that his greed and selfishness had cost him the only family he had left. As the dust from the departing riders settled, Running Bear approached the cabin with Wind in the trees and several other tribal elders. The elderly medicine woman immediately took charge of Mary Beth and the baby, checking both for any signs of distress from the stressful birth. "Strong mother, strong child," she announced after her examination. "Birth blessing successful despite white men's interference. baby will grow tall and wise like his father." Running Bear clasped Jonas's arm in the traditional gesture of brotherhood. "You fought well, Mountain Walker, showed courage and wisdom when faced with overwhelming odds. Your woman also showed great strength. Ute Nation is proud to call you family." As evening fell and their unexpected allies prepared to depart, Mary Beth sat by the fire with Samuel at her breast and Jonas's strong arm around her shoulders. The legal battle was far from over. Blackwood and the railroad would return with new strategies and greater force, but for now they were safe in their valley sanctuary. "What do you think will happen next?" Mary Beth asked, watching the firelight play across her son's peaceful features. "The railroad will try legal channels first," Jonas replied thoughtfully. "When that fails, they'll probably attempt to pressure the territorial government into changing the eminent domain laws, and if that doesn't work, they'll try something else," Mary Beth finished. "Something more direct." Jonas nodded grimly. "But we'll be ready for them, and we won't be facing them alone." Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a wolf called to its mate. The valley settled into the peaceful quiet of night, but inside the cabin 3 people sat by the fire and contemplated the future they were building together, one battle at a time. Samuel stirred in his mother's arms and opened his eyes, looking up at the faces surrounding him with the curious gaze of someone just beginning to understand the world he'd been born into. It was a world full of challenges and dangers, but it was also full of love and protection and the fierce determination of people who would fight to their last breath to keep their family safe. Mary Beth began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had sung to her as a child, and gradually Jonas's deep voice joined hers in the familiar melody. The music filled the cabin with warmth and peace, a lullaby for their newborn son and a promise to whatever gods watched over such moments that this family would endure no matter what storms might come. In the months and years ahead, there would be more battles to fight, more challenges to overcome. The railroad's lawyers would return with new strategies and greater resources. Corrupt officials would find new ways to threaten their peaceful existence. The harsh realities of frontier life would test their strength and resolve in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But on this night, in this moment, they were complete. A family forged in the crucible of hardship and sealed by grace, standing together against whatever the future might bring. And in the end, Mary Beth thought as she drifted off to sleep, with her husband's arms around her and her son safe at her side, that was enough. That was everything.